Good morning, all. So today's goal is using the quadratic formula. So I know you guys have used the quadratic formula before, but maybe not in quite a while. So today we're going to hit a recap and use this to solve quadratics. The quadratic formula can be used on any quadratic equation. I know for a bunch of them, like square roots can only be used at certain times. Factoring can only be used at certain times. Completing the square can only be used at certain times. Quadratic formula is a end-all, be-all, works every time. It's just a little bit complicated. So it's one, if you master it, awesome, you can always use it. Otherwise, it's something where you try to factor a problem, it doesn't work. You try to take a square root, it doesn't work, then you have to go quadratic formula. So for the quadratic formula, first off, just like factoring, the equation must be equal to 0. And then from there, you're in standard form. So notice we have ax squared plus bx plus c, then has to be equal to 0. The a value, so notice in our equation, the opposite of b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. This a value goes in two spots. That a value is always the coefficient of x squared. So it's not necessarily always the first number. You always want to make sure your equation is arranged right first. It's always the coefficient to x squared. B is always your coefficient to x, and that one goes into two spots. Notice it's the opposite b, and then be very careful whenever you have a b squared here. Make sure you're putting your b in parentheses with the square on the outside, so that way if it happens to be negative, the square fixes itself. And then c is always the constant at the end. Notice there is no x term with the c, it's just the normal plain number, the constant, and that goes in the equation in one spot. So keep in mind, it matters not necessarily the order of the a, b, and c, but what is the coefficient to. So like, for example, if I had 2x squared plus 3 equals 0. In this case, there's no x term. That means that our b value would be 0, because technically that would be like a 0x in there. So like in this case, our a value would be 2, our b value is 0, our c value is 3. Another example, if I have negative x squared minus 2x equals 0. Okay, again, there's only two terms. This time we're missing the constant, we're missing the c value. So here, a value is still what's with x squared. Always that coefficient, so it'd be negative 1. In this case, we have an x term, so the b value would be negative 2. We're missing the c value there. So it matters what is the coefficient to, especially when you're missing a term, to figure that out. So now the book walks through, I'm going to walk through it here with you as well. So we have negative 4x squared minus 40x minus 99. This is on page 85 in your book. If you want to open up, write any notes down as I work through it. So first thing with quadratic formula, you have to identify what your a, b, and c are. So in this case, our a is negative 4. B is the number with x, that's negative 40. And c is negative 99, and now we just plug everything in. I'm going to write it down up here for myself. A, c, all over 2a. Okay, so we have x equals, and again, this is solving for the roots of the parabola. We are looking for our x-intercepts. So if we plug this in, the opposite of b gives me a positive 40. Plus or minus a big square root. And here's where make sure you use parentheses. Negative 40 with a square on the outside. Minus 4a and c. And then all over 2 times a. So this is a bit messy, but we just want to look at it little pieces at a time. The first part you always want to deal with is this big chunk under the square root. Think of that as your parentheses. So we're going to simplify that first. Everything else I'm going to keep the same. All over. So negative 40 squared gives me a positive 1600. Again, make sure you use those parentheses. And then negative 4 times negative 99 times 4 gives us minus 1584. Notice there were 3 negatives there. 1, 2, 3. Since there was an odd number of negatives, it still stayed negative in my equation. And then on the bottom, We have 2 times -4. We can go ahead and do that part as well since it is not related to the other, and that gives us -8. Now, still need to deal with the square root. So we have 40 plus or minus 1600 minus 1584 is 16. Didn't need to make that square root so big, now did I? That was my new part, so I'll write it in a different color. All over -8. And for the sake of this, we can get rid of some of that. Okay, so now we can go ahead and separate this out and simplify our square root. So when I say separate this out, what I mean, we have a plus or a minus here. That means we have 2 different roots. Just like when we took a square root and had to deal with a plus or minus, same deal. We're going to have 40 plus the square root of 16 all over -8. And we're going to have 40 minus the square root of 16 all over a -8. These last few steps are on the simplifying part. We're going to simplify that square root and then deal with our fractions. So let me scroll down a bit here. Woo. So we can see what we're doing. Okay, get this 85 out of the way. So first, our square root. We have the square root of 16, which if you type that in a calculator is an exact value. The square root of 16 is 4. So this turns into 40 plus 4 over -8. We want to deal with the top of that fraction first. 40 plus 4 is 44 over -8. And then if we type that into a calculator, we get -5.5 for that root. On the right-hand side, again, square root of 16 is still 4. So we get x equals 40 minus 4 over the square over -8. 40 minus 4 is 36 over -8. And then 36 divided by -8 is a -4.5. So we have 2 answers. You should always have 2 answers unless you end up with a square root of 0. You just have to split that root at the end. If we could not have taken a square root there, we could have just stopped at this step if the square root cannot simplify, and that's just a matter of leaving our answers exact. So for today, you're just going to be practicing using that square root. On Mathia, it'll very much work it out where makes you do each part of the problem at a time. So hopefully that'll help you get used to using the quadratic formula. If you have any questions, just ask. I'm on Zoom at the front of the room, ready to help.